welcome to The Extra Mile. I'm Linda BOUDREAUX. Our guest today is Kevin Bell. Kevin's with National Foundation, and we're going to be talking about your foundation and what you need to know to keep your home safe and secure. And Kevin is an old friend who's been on occasion, off and on for the last, 10, 12 years,
I'd say possibly 12 years, yeah.
Yeah, for a good while. Because, and I keep asking you to come back, Kevin, because I think that there's a lot of misinformation and misconception and fear around our foundations because we're always afraid our house is going to fall down. And
That's true.
so I want you to kind of help us to understand all that.
Sure.
So, well, welcome.
Glad for having me back. I appreciate you having me back.
So tell us about foundations and what's involved in foundation repair.
Well, you know, the foundation is probably the most important component of a structure of our homes, obviously, and a lot hinges upon the performance of our foundation. If for example, we assume our house or our building is going to remain flat forever,
And it won't?
and then we assume that our building is going to remain one piece forever, and it's not going to become three different components moving their own way. But the reality is we live on a soil here. We build on soil conditions here that are less than optimal, and you know, we've got clay soil. It's kind of easy to imagine a home built on a rocky area or even on sand, something that kind of stays the same. But our clay soil is always shrinking and swelling, and depending on the moisture level, and as this volume change occurs, it moves us around. And so it's not really a matter of if we're going to move or not move, but more whether that movement's even or uneven. And it's when it's uneven that we start to experience, you know, the common symptoms of doors that don't work and walls that crack. And it's at a minimum frustrating and cosmetic. And under the worst case scenario, it can provide functional and in rare cases unsafe conditions as well.
Okay, so it's something that we need to be aware of. And what you just said, I think, is so important for us to remember is that, you know, we built our house, but it's really a dynamic event. I mean, it's moving with Mother Earth all the time.
It
right?
is, and you know, we understand the need to get a new roof periodically,
Yeah.
and we know that painting is important to preserve the wood. But you just kind of think the foundation's there forever, and it doesn't require any thought or any sort of maintenance.
And I guess what you're saying is that we need to maintain our foundations too?
Well, we need to do what we can to ensure that conditions don't change underneath our foundation. And the most common example of that would be the extended period with no rain that we go through every summer.
Is that not good?
No, that's not good. It's not good, not necessarily because conditions are dry, but simply because that dryness is inconsistent around our home. For example, it will be much drier on the end of the home where there's a group of trees. And those trees may not have even been there when we built the home. And so as they get bigger, they take things and solids and primarily fluids, moisture. They take stuff out of the soil that actually affects the volume of the earth itself. So this shrinking and swelling we can encourage that to be even by just understanding at what time of the year we should irrigate the most. It's pretty self-evident. We need to water our yards and simulate rain, I guess, when we're not getting it.
But it's not just for our trees, and it's really for the stability of our foundation. Am I hearing that right?
You're hearing that right.
Okay.
I mean, you know, our trees very rarely die during a drought, so we don't feel the need necessarily to water our yard for the trees. Maybe for the shrubs we just invested.
Grass or whatever.
Sure, we don't want our grass to turn. But in the same time that we're irrigating for those purposes, we're also encouraging the conditions that promote better foundation performance. And we're primarily talking about right now the most common type of foundation failure. Most of us build on slabs.
I was going to ask you that.
Concrete.
We have two different ways to build, right? Piers and slabs, right?
Basically so. And there's a whole set of circumstances that can occur to houses on piers. I mean, probably the worst thing that could happen to us on a pier and beam home, maybe the kind of home that you'd find in closer to downtown that had been around for the long. It's a perfectly acceptable technique, by the way. But
I hope so.
you have, and you can't expect the same performance, obviously, with those homes. They have a total different character about them. They're going to shake a bit when you run down the hallway, for example. But you can have termites. We can have dry rot due to lack of ventilation.
Okay.
There's a whole myriad of problems that can exist. At least with a slab home, it's fairly simple.
Okay, so it's really easier sometimes to repair a slab than it would be a pier?
It's in most cases, there's fewer things that can go wrong with it.
Okay.
We've talked a little bit about uneven settlement due to uneven soil conditions, but there is a problem that actually, in my opinion, is 100% preventable, but it has to be done during the construction phase. You have to pour concrete of any substantial size. You have to have a skeleton in it. It has to be. That's a good way to describe steel reinforcement. It's got to have an ingredient in there that allows it to bend and move some, which obviously creates cracks. But we want those cracks to remain small forever.
Okay. So we don't mind a crack. A crack is okay as long as it's small.
In fact, it's not only okay, but in any kind of foundation that would be as large as even a small home, that's too big not to crack.
Okay.
Think about a well-made sidewalk that you would see, or sections of the roadway.
Mm-hmm.
They're all built in sections with
Right,
joints, and the
right.
joints help prevent cracks.
Okay.
But with what's called a monolithic slab, a one-piece slab, it's very important that it stay one piece, and because there's no joints, the concrete sort of has to crack to relieve stress. And most of that stress, a lot of the stress, occurs during the curing process. So knowing our slab's going to crack because of stress, most of which is normal, we have to put something in it to hold it together forever. And assuming we do that, which is perfectly doable, we're capable of controlling that type of failure if we just use good techniques.
Okay, and we know what they are.
We know what they are. There's the old reinventing the wheel periodically, and maybe not seeing the forest for the trees with different construction techniques. And those construction techniques evolve for different reasons. It's not always a better result. The evolution of construction is not always beneficial to the owner of the building that's being built long term. Maybe it's a construction technique that's allowed for other reasons, and so sometimes we end up with a new technique that's not always best.
Okay.
But assuming we do the right things to concrete that really do hold it together, that leaves only one real problem that our home can have, and that's that first most common problem, which is
the uneven.
Yeah, the uneven movement, which again is a soil issue that we have some control over.
Okay. So if somebody's building a house, then it would be to their advantage to become at least somewhat knowledgeable about what has to happen when concrete is poured, so that they can kind of keep an eye on it.
I think that's important for consumers building homes to be aware that there's information that they need to know. We make assumptions that the professionals we hire kind of know it all.
And that they'll do it. They'll do what they know.
Right. And you can be a very good builder, you can be a very good architect, and you can be a perfectly adequate engineer and have built homes for 10 years before the first potential foundation problem rears its ugly head. So there's sort of the learning curve's a little bit beyond the horizon for a lot of people to predict the problems, I should say. So yeah, that's important to get educated. It's also important for builders to make sure that their clients are educated. If I'm a builder, I don't want to be blamed for something that's not a problem, or I don't want the fear or of the unknown that my client may have to put pressure on me as a builder for no good reason. So I think everybody benefits from good information. That way, when there's a little issue that's not that bad of a problem, or that has a simple remedy or an obvious cause that's easy to address, we don't instinctively expect the worst case scenario because of our own ignorance. And I think it's in the builder's best interest, therefore, to have a homeowner that, listen, a good example, Linda, if I'm an owner of a piece of property I want to build on at some point in the future, and if I elect as a property owner to wait to the last minute to prepare my property, and yet I want my builder to build my home next week, well, there's certain issues that I've created by preparing the lot rather quickly. I'm not sure that's the builder's fault
Right.
to tell me
Right.
that I should have done that 3 years ago, or I
Right.
should have done that as early as possible. So, and yet the first person I may blame if I get a crack in my wall, I may instinctively be thinking about my builder.
Right. And blaming him for the problem.
Yeah, and wondering if maybe he didn't do something he shouldn't, when really it's just that I've got a lot of activity going on in this soil. And the reality is time's probably going to be on my side and things may stabilize. So that's just one example of.
Okay. So when we're getting ready to build, and I know most people have already built, but just to take it back to the beginning, should we do a soil analysis before we do anything else, or is our soil pretty much uniform?
Well, it doesn't hurt, obviously, but, we can test the soil all day long, and this may sound silly, but you can have horrible soil, whatever that means. I don't know, what is good soil? What's horrible soil? It's all kind of nasty to me, But I mean, if you have the same soil under the same structure would help. So I'm not sure.
Uniform soil.
Yeah, at least our building's going to be doing sort of the same thing overall. And remember, we move regardless. Our foundation moves when the best soil we can get is clay. I mean, the best thing we can have here locally, the best, as good as it gets, is going to be a type soil that swells and shrinks.
Okay, we're just not doing better than that.
It's hard to get better than that,
Okay.
and really along in this area. It's called alluvial clay soil. It has to do with, millions of years, I guess, of stuff a geologist could tell you more about.
But it's there.
But the result is we
It's
don't
there.
have rock under our homes,
Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
not till you go extremely deep. So we just have to encourage even movement. So I think a lot of times when we do soil tests, which I'm not at all saying that's not a good idea, but I've seen soil tests done in one location per job site, or maybe in 3 locations around a property. Maybe they may bore holes to examine conditions at different soil stratas. And I've seen them come up with the results of those soil tests that confirm what we may assume, which is there's a lot of clay in the soil. But the composition of that soil from my bedroom to my kitchen is what's going to determine how, whether I move evenly or unevenly. So sometimes I think that we may pass up an opportunity to get even more important data, which is to find out, does our soil condition vary from here to there? That's almost as important as what is the soil itself.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, what I was kind of wondering, because when you talk about even movement, you're going to want to have an even condition, and it could affect the layout of the house. I'm thinking if you really knew.
It can certainly influence the design of your foundation.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's say that you think maybe you do have a problem. First of all, what are the telltale signs?
Well, I guess that's the question. Everybody's kind of familiar with cracked walls and doors. Maybe
But other things can cause those too, right?
There are some. There are many. We tend to build with sheetrock these days.
Right.
Paneling was a great wall covering, but it's not something that we think about as a choice wall covering.
It's not too pretty.
It seems dated, and of course, we can paint it whatever color we want, but still the idea of not having drywall. And there's certain characteristics about drywall, the sound, the acoustics of it, and the fireproofing of it. And again, this is well out of my area of expertise, but we pick drywall for good reasons. But it's brittle, and it doesn't accept dimension changes very well. So when our foundation becomes a little bit out of level, it affects our door frames, maybe not enough to make them rub or to make them drag or to make them not lock properly, but it's enough to make sheetrock crack. So we tend to see wall stresses, to answer your question. There are other occurrences that can occur, so it's important not to assume the worst when you see a crack in the wall, but just to kind of make sure that it's not something developing that would indicate a problem with your foundation that, number one, you may be able to avoid by a different pattern of irrigation or water in your yard. Okay. Sometimes a tree that didn't hurt us for 30 years finally gets big enough when combined with the dry weather to sort of affect our volume of our soil. And a lot of times you can prune that tree, which makes it act a little younger, take a little less water, and then you can irrigate. And just understanding the need to do that, we can keep our home flatter.
So this is really a holistic kind of taking
That's a good
the
word.
yard
Sure.
and the house and the materials and the weather and everything into consideration to figure out how to stabilize. I'm thinking the entire environment of your home and yard.
Oh, I think that's a great way to
Yeah.
look at it. Understand it's just a system of our home. Again, we
That
understand
includes our yard.
That's right. If we understand the roof leaking, and we understand, I guess a related subject might be, or sort of analogy might be, that we don't like to see pine straw from a pine tree build up in our valleys of our roof, because it's detrimental to the roof's
Yeah.
life, and we kind of just instinctively know that. But the same kind of consideration, I think, should be given to the long-term performance of our foundation. What is it about our yard? What is it about the way the water drains? And what is it about our landscaping scheme that may encourage bad performance? And just kind of, typically what's good for your yard is good for your foundation. And a lot of our phone calls in the spring when we're getting the most rain, Linda, and we joke about it a lot actually at the office, but a lot of our phone calls are people actually calling to tell us how much better things are performing, and all they're doing is sort of witnessing and then revealing to us the evidence that rain we had for 2 months has been beneficial to their homes. And there's a clue there. There's a clue there as to what we need to do the following summer. And it's usually reduce the effects of the trees, which can be done by pruning. We can make an older tree act young again to some degree,
Okay.
by pruning it. Maybe it beautifies it at the same time. And then we can irrigate more when it's really dry, and knowing where to do that's important.
So where do we irrigate?
Well, it's important to irrigate where you would assume the soil is going to be dehydrated or dry out at the fastest rate.
Okay.
So that typically means let's water a little more often near the trees than we do
Mhm.
on the end of our home where there's no tree.
So it's really, talking to you, it sounds like a lot of it has to do with the trees.
It does have a lot to do with the trees, and we're in the South, and we love trees, and we have trees, and it adds to the character of our properties, and it would be not the same, obviously, to have no trees, and I'm certainly not a proponent of having no trees.
No, you're not an advocate of cutting down trees.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
My goodness, no. And maybe it might seem that way, but they're smart trees to have. I mean, as consumers, we want shade, but we don't want it in 17 years. We want it next week. So we tend to buy
Yeah.
the trees that grow extremely fast.
Like, what would that be, like a river birch or?
Yeah, river birches and Bradford pears and Drake elms, and I'm probably not doing anybody a service that sells these items, but putting them in our flower beds close to our home is not always the wisest thing to do.
We
And
can
yet-
have them further out.
We can have them a little further away, and we can have them under any circumstance as long as we understand what's the result of that investment. We're creating a demand. That demand accelerates, and at some point when we have an unseasonable dry spell, maybe the worst in 10 years, the combination of that new demand and that lack of supply can hurt us, and we just have to be aware of that. So
I'm going to say this in really simple terms for people that are watching. So if you plant, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but if you plant a fast-growing tree that really is going to demand, I guess, a lot of water, is that fair? Is that what
Sure.
they do? They take a lot of water, have a shallow root system or something, they get water?
I'm not sure about where the roots
Well,
are, which is
and
another
but it's-
misconception.
a fast
It's about
growing-
how much water they
With a
take.
fast-growing tree, you better water that tree during a drought,
Yeah.
because that tree is going to suck the water out of your soil,
Right.
and that's going to affect your foundation. Is that right?
That's how it works, basically. Now, there's another ingredient here in this, that we have to discuss, and that's the inevitability that the code, as it's written today, allows foundations to be fairly shallow. Now, these inconsistencies, we need to discuss this, these inconsistencies with moisture level from one end of our home to the other, that's aggravated by trees that weren't here when we built. Okay, that discussion needs to be made, and that's what we can control to some degree. But the reality is that code allows our houses to be built relatively shallow. And these inconsistencies are a shallow phenomenon. If we have deeper foundations when we build our home, the issue of the tree on the end of the home is slightly less or considerably less of an issue. For example, that Bradford pear that we had to have to shade our window, and we planted it in our flower bed. it's affecting surface soil first.
Right.
And we can ill afford to have an extended dry period without fearing that tree may hurt the ability of our foundation to support us. But if our foundation's deeper, obviously, it takes a lot longer for that soil to be influenced by that tree. So we can design in, when we build a home, certain safeguards that sort of guard us for these radical conditions that come.
So if we're building new, we could have a deeper foundation.
Deeper foundations, in most cases, are advantageous to have. Yeah, that would be when we're doing remediation, when we're doing what we do for a living, and when we're doing it in the best scenario where your efforts to change soil conditions didn't work, your efforts to reduce the demand of the trees was unsuccessful. The trees add a lot of value to our properties. We want to figure out a way to live with them, and we end up having to redesign the foundation to meet those needs. So that consistency the builder gave us everywhere is if we were never going to plant trees, and that sort of goes away after 20 or 30 years, and now we have to start retrofitting our house, so to speak, to live with the reality. Hey, our neighbor does have an oak now, or or we love our pecan tree. And so we have to sort of modify the foundation to take some of the pressure off, or you to water your yard or to prune the tree. So we come from a preventative standpoint through advising people, and then with the understanding we can always make modifications to that original design so that it performs better under those conditions.
Okay, so and you actually would go out and work with homeowners and help them kind of understand what they need to do or what they can do.
That's, from a personal standpoint, within my business, that's what I enjoy doing. That's kind of where I've evolved to, I guess. And I think that it can make a big difference. And in addition to things evolving, while we're talking about that, there's a lot of consultation that's I think very well considered. And that's the consultation regarding the transfer of an asset or the buying and selling of a home that may or may not have that problem. Any sort of question regarding that issue, whether it's a homeowner just trying to do the best they can do to keep their home performing as much like its original performance as possible, or whether it's a buying and selling situation where there's decisions being made, sometimes the biggest financial decision we may ever make.
It is, yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah, we come from a position of, I think, being able to help through those periods, but with as an advocate, so to speak, and we're doing more and more of that actually, and I think it's something that's worthy.
Well, as I've told you before, that's really how we met. I was buying some property, and I thought I had a foundation problem, and you came and you said, no, it's fine.
I
was so grateful for that.
I remember that,
like,
actually.
It's like, wow.
Well, good.
He could have done all kinds of work, and he didn't. And
things worked out?
And they worked out great, and there's still no foundation problem. So, but because we don't know, and it is so scary. We're getting kind of short on time, but I do want to touch on the fact that if somebody does need foundation work, is it a horrible thing to have to go through? I shouldn't ask you that, but it's a big deal.
It can be extremely intrusive. Obviously, it is intrusive by nature. To the whole just the thought of the process and the fear. The fear doesn't have to be there all the time, but it can be. But that's part of the evolution of our business is such that we make it as easy on people as possible. So we end up being sort of semi-professional landscape guys, and we take down and rebuild fences fairly well, and
you do as much as you can to make it as painless as possible.
As painless and as inexpensive as possible.
Yeah, because it's also can be a big investment for people.
I can tell you that from the feedback I get from our clients, it's usually not as bad as they assumed it would be.
I think when we talk about foundation, we always expect the worst, and yet it really doesn't have to be.
And that's certainly understandable.
Yeah. So in the last minute that we have, what do you want people to take away from today's show?
Well, I think probably a couple of things. Number one, I think that the assumption that foundation problems are the kiss of death, so to speak, is just certainly not a correct assumption. in reality, you can become aware of when you can become aware of less than optimal performance, and you can end up with a foundation design under the worst case scenario that's better than the initial foundation construction. So you could certainly make a case for your home being worth more. And nobody wants to be the first one on the block to have the problem, but nobody wants the home that didn't get fixed yet
Right.
when it's the only one left on the block that didn't get repaired. So there's this sort of pack mentality about it, and most of that's unjustified. And so the misunderstanding, I think that ignorance about this subject can be expensive. It can be expensive.
And so our goal today is to help people become educated, and if they have more questions, they can call you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We're out of time, but thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful having you back with us. We have been talking to Kevin Bell with National Foundation Repair about our foundations. If you have questions, give them a call.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you. And thank you for watching The Extra Mile.